Welcome to Dust History. The bells of the convent rang for the final time. High in the mountains of Thessaly, where olive trees trembled in the autumn breeze, a small group of nuns assembled inside their decaying chapel. They worshipped beneath fractured frescoes. Saints with countenances long eroded by time and grief. On the horizon, flames glimmered. Ottoman standards were already discernible, scarlet fabric rippling like embers across the peaks. The women understood precisely what that signified. No horsemen arrived from the neighboring villages. No warriors stayed to protect them, merely the quiet before invasion. Their abbess, Sister Eleni of Lissa, stood before the altar grasping a silver crucifix that had endured 100 years of tempests. She murmured, "Should they penetrate our walls, maintain your pledges within your souls that they cannot seize." Yet she was mistaken. When the empire's forces arrived at the convent entrance, commitments, devotions, and holiness signified nothing against what history attempted to obliterate. If you're fascinated by documented accounts from the Ottoman-Byzantine borders, remember to subscribe. It assists us in discovering more narratives concealed in archives, from missionary correspondence to Vatican documents. Now, returning to the narrative. The initial stones of the convent fell before dusk. The sacred songs that once resonated through those corridors were overpowered by metal and shrieks. The Ottomans didn't expend projectiles on sacred sites. They demolished the entrances with artillery blasts, simultaneously a caution and an announcement. To them, a convent wasn't hallowed territory. It represented resistance, evidence that the cross still courageously emerged on vanquished earth. Within, the sisters concealed their sacred objects, silver goblets, embellished religious images, pieces of saintly remains beneath the chapel foundation. They trusted that should their physical forms perish, their spiritual conviction could persist. However, the soldiers didn't seek valuables. They desired confirmation that they had vanquished not merely the adversary's forces, but their deity as well. By darkness, the enduring nuns were gathered into the courtyard. Flame illumination transformed their white garments into fluctuating amber and obscurity. They were informed they would be brought before the Pasha, an assurance scarcely anyone survived to witness realized. The subsequent events transformed into folklore, so dreadful that even ecclesiastical historians shunned the specifics. By sunrise, the convent had become cinders. Smoke billowed from the dining hall where the women previously shared nourishment and quietude. Ottoman banners waved from the bell tower, indicating to nearby contingents that opposition had ceased. Nevertheless, in that courtyard, something unforeseen occurred. The soldiers, anticipating cries, heard chanting instead. Secured with cords, the remaining sisters commenced to recite a sacred song not of hopelessness but resistance. The Agnus Dei, Lamb of God who removes the transgressions of humanity. Their vocalizations quivered yet never faltered. The Ottoman commander, uncertain whether to mock or quiet them, commanded the abbess to be pulled forward. Eleni still grasped the silver crucifix salvaged from the altar. The commander offered her clemency. Should she reject her deity and embrace the invaders' beliefs, her sisters would survive. Her response determined her destiny. "I have already surrendered my existence. What additional thing might you seize?" The commander paused, possibly affected, then turned aside, abandoning her to his soldiers. The subsequent events were never completely documented. Even Ottoman chronicles which celebrated triumph characterized it merely as correction for those who defied logic. Nevertheless, in subsequent European correspondence, her name reappeared. Eleni of Lissa, the nun who refused to bow. By noon, the convent's bells were liquefied for currency, and the rooftop crucible transported eastward as a prize. However, quickly, whispers circulated throughout adjacent settlements. They claimed that when the breeze traversed the remnants after dark, one could still perceive feminine voices, not weeping, but worshipping. The smoke had scarcely dissipated when the procession commenced. What remained of the religious community? 22 women in frayed garments were forced southward toward the shoreline, ankles restrained, observed by Ottoman cavalry toward the empire. They weren't captives of conflict, but emblems of subjugation, evidence that even hallowed barriers could collapse. The expedition was pitiless. The sun burned the pathway. The sisters, who had never ventured beyond their monastery, faltered from dehydration and fatigue. When one collapsed, another elevated her head, covering so warriors wouldn't tread upon it. Ultimate gesture of honor in a realm deprived of compassion. Their abbess had vanished, yet her final statements persisted among them. Should you be unable to grasp the crucifix, grasp one another. Following 7 days of marching, the prisoners arrived at the harbor of Volos. Awaiting them were Ottoman galleys, vessels constructed not for ease, but for domination. The women were gathered onto the ships, wrists chained to wooden seats where lawbreakers and bondsmen previously traveled. As the sails captured the breeze, the coastlines of Greece vanished into the distance, and alongside them everything they had previously recognized. The vessel's supervisor, Isef Adger, maintained detailed logs, merchandise, seasonings, currency, fabrics, and spiritual prisoners. It was this precise register uncovered ages afterward in the archives of Istanbul that verified a narrative formerly disregarded as folklore. The journey to Constantinople endured 12 days. Tempests struck the deck. Salt irritated their injuries. Famine sunk in their features. However, what devastated them most wasn't agony. It was quietude. Nobody communicated with them except to shout orders. They existed like specters drifting between sky and ocean. During nighttime, the youngest, Sister Magdalena, murmured sacred songs under her breath. Her vocalization was weak, scarcely perceptible above the roaring waves. Yet even the manacled captives surrounding her, Greeks, Serbs, and Italians, rotated their heads to hear. For an instant, the ocean appeared to calm. When the vessel ultimately entered the Bosphorus, the sisters observed the skyline of Constantinople emerge before them, its domes and minarets gleaming like blades in the daybreak. Across the strait, the metropolis appeared animate, inhaling with authority. For ages, it had been termed the city of global longing. Presently, it would transform into their enclosure. From the wharves, they were marched through cramped avenues flanked by traders, warriors, and bondsmen. Native inhabitants halted to gaze. Christian nuns among prisoners were uncommon. Even in an empire founded on subjugation, they were guided beyond the ancient fortifications of Blacherny toward the imperial quarter where their destinies would be determined. In the shadow of Hagia Sophia, the formerly magnificent cathedral of Christianity, they were compelled to bend their knees. As the muezzin's summons reverberated from the minarets, one of the sisters breathed, "We have returned home, yet it no longer belongs to us." Prior to sunrise, they were escorted into a marble courtyard encircled by soaring pillars. This wasn't a prison. It was the Divanai Humayun, the imperial council, where the decree of the sultan governed above everything. Here, prisoners weren't evaluated by monarchs or clergy, but by empire itself. For the nuns of Thessaly, their spiritual conviction would be weighed against the principles of invasion. At the heart of the chamber resided the Grand Vizier, a man whose countenance revealed nothing. To his left, record-keepers waited with ink and vellum, prepared to document every particular, appellations, years, and designated purposes. Each utterance would be inscribed into ledgers that still endure centuries afterward, marked by wax and age. The sisters stood in tattered garments, gazes downcast. Via interpreters, they were informed the Sultan had bestowed compassion upon one stipulation. Those who embraced religious conversion would receive new identities, nourishment, and existence within the palace. Those who declined would encounter the correction of belief, an expression that could signify incarceration or vanishing. None uttered a sound. Sister Magdalena quivered. She had witnessed what transpired with other prisoners presented before the vizier. Greeks, Armenians, Slavs, all consumed by the empire's quietude. Prior to the guards being able to pull her ahead, one of the seniors, Sister Dorothea, moved away from the formation. She spoke to the vizier not as a prisoner, but as someone who had existed sufficiently lengthy to observe empires ascend and decline. "My lord," she stated, "you might rechristen us, yet you cannot recompose the devotions we bear. The translator paused, uncertain whether to convey such statements. When he did, the vizier's expression stayed inscrutable. Subsequently, he responded frigidly, "Devotions diminish when the speech organ forgets how to articulate them." With a gesture of his hand, the sisters were sent away, not to execution, but to the subterranean quarters of Topkapi Palace, where unclassified prisoners were detained. Some would deem it clemency. Others would subsequently designate it something considerably more dreadful. Some were assigned an alternative form of confinement, one masked as duty. Underneath the palace gardens existed a maze of stone corridors sealed from the sunlight. Each compartment possessed a narrow aperture for illumination, scarcely sufficient to distinguish nighttime from daytime. The nuns were stripped of their religious attire, dressed in coarse apparel, and informed they would now perform labor scrubbing surfaces, stitching clothing, tending flames for the upper quarters. It was intended to crush them, to transform sacredness into bondage. However, the Ottomans undervalued them. These were women who had previously existed under pledges of quietude and self-denial. Starvation, chill, and seclusion were not unfamiliar. For them, anguish wasn't retribution. It was piety manifested. Even within this underground incarceration, their self-control transformed into protection. During darkness, they worshipped clandestinely. One engraved a crucifix into the clay barrier with her fingernail. Another sketched sacred writings into the dust underneath her straw mattress. They commenced tracking days by the cadence of the muezzin's summons, not because of conversion, but as a defiant chronometer for belief that declined to perish. Shortly, murmurs circulated among the attendants. There existed narratives of the silent sisters, foreign women interred beneath the palace who never communicated, never pleaded. Some deemed them hexed, others designated them holy. Their quietude reverberated through the passages more powerfully than supplication. Days merged into months. Their hands developed sores from toil, laundering fabrics, buffing bronze, maintaining flames that provided warmth to others, but none to themselves. Their identities were prohibited. Each female was assigned a numeral, a symbol of possession. The empire believed duration and starvation would influence even the most resilient conviction. That was when the subsequent phase commenced, an examination masked as compassion. Initially arrived benevolence. Nourishment, oil, and silks were delivered to their living spaces. Educated men from the palace arrived to speak softly, proposing repose, tranquility, even minor liberties. Your deity and ours aren't adversaries. One imam stated, "Adopt our language and you shall be liberated." Yet they all comprehended what that liberty represented, eliminating the remembrance of their identity. To forget constituted the single transgression they couldn't perpetrate. Sister Magdalena, formerly delicate and quivering, commenced to emerge as their fortitude. She murmured excerpts of sacred texts recollected from their convent, passages partially forgotten, reformed into devotions that sustained them. Despite being incomplete, the sacred word persisted. When enticement proved unsuccessful, the disguises were removed. The flambeaux were extinguished, sustenance reduced by half. No more compassionate visits, merely quietude and obscurity. Individually, they were escorted to a confined chamber where record-keepers awaited. Each was instructed to repeat a single expression of submission. Those who complied were permitted to reside within the palace barriers. Those who declined vanished. It wasn't one magnificent deed of brutality, but a gradual, systematic shattering of the spirit. Belief wasn't removed through violence. It was gradually eroded by starvation, anticipation, and the subdued voice inquiring, "Why endure suffering for a deity who doesn't respond?" Several surrendered. 2 sisters from Corfu, twins, ultimately breathed the statements. They were clothed in silk and removed, never to be observed again. For those who stayed, each vanishing strengthened their determination. Sister Dorothea, formerly courageous before the Grand Vizier, became gaunt and pallid. When guards inquired her identity, she smiled weakly. "Address me as Silence," she stated. Her resistance disseminated like infection. From that instant, None of them communicated with their captors again. When interrogated, they responded solely with immobility. And within that immobility, they reclaimed what the empire believed it had seized: command. Official chronicles reference them merely incidentally. Foreign prisoners, uncommunicative, inefficient. To the Ottomans, they represented unsuccessful religious transformations. To history, they transformed into something different, living evidence that belief could persist where barriers and shackles couldn't. By the time spring revisited the palace gardens above, merely 11 of the initial 22 remained living. The guards designated them specters in tatters. However, the attendants murmured of something more peculiar, that occasionally deep in the night faint vocalizations could be perceived beneath the palace, reciting in a dialect nobody recalled but everybody dreaded. It was identical sacred song they had chanted as their convent burned. And within those neglected passageways where no sunlight penetrated, the survivors discovered something unforeseen: an ancient sealed entrance concealed in dust and rock. Initially, it served as a refuge, but gradually it transformed into something consecrated. They utilized fractured ceramics for candle supports, a fragment of linen for an altar covering. From a fragment of a broken looking-glass, they constructed a primitive crucifix. Within this clandestine sanctuary, they assembled each evening after the palace slumbered. No sacred songs, no homilies, merely murmurs. Each female kneeled and shared a recollection: a dwelling, a church bell, the warmth of bread prior to sunrise. These recollections transformed into their new sacred songs, modest tributes to a deity who still heeded in the darkness. A Venetian captive once documented peculiar vocalizations resonating beneath the harem, women vocalizing in Latin to a deity not belonging to this empire. For ages, historians disregarded it as superstition until beneath the top-copy remnants, archaeologists unearthed a small compartment adorned with Christian etchings, silent evidence that their devotions had never genuinely ceased. Crucifixes engraved into the rock. A Latin expression partially obliterated by age reads, "In tenebris lucet." The illumination radiates in the obscurity. That modest revelation transformed everything. It demonstrated these women hadn't merely disappeared. They had left an impression, a silent rebellion inscribed into the barriers. Within the concealed sanctuary, Sister Magdalena, formerly delicate, presently the core of their belief, commenced marking the barriers with charcoal. Identities couldn't be documented openly. Consequently, she designed symbols instead. A bird for each sister still existing, a small flame for those who had perished. Whenever a new bird didn't materialize, it signified another had vanished. The guards never discovered the sanctuary, yet they commenced to perceive subtle alterations in their prisoners. Despite the starvation, the chill, and the confinement, the women moved with a tranquil, nearly supernatural composure. The supervisors designated it insanity. However, the record-keepers observing them documented something completely different. They had uncovered a fortitude not originating from this world. Their clandestine worship persisted for months, possibly years. And although the empire attempted to eliminate every indication of their presence, the sanctuary transformed into their ultimate demonstration of resistance. Not with armaments, not with objection, but through a belief that declined to perish. By the time a new sultan ascended to authority, merely a handful of the sisters remained, exhausted, elderly, nearly disregarded. Nevertheless, beneath the palace, their secret sanctuary persisted. Quiet, concealed, everlasting. Ages afterward, when contemporary explorers investigated Constantinople, nobody anticipated that beneath strata of marble and empire, the imprints of these women would still exist. Women who had worshipped in darkness, abandoning behind the sole element the conquerors could never assert, their belief engraved in stone. By 1482, the palace had transferred authority again. A new sultan, youthful and determined, mounted the throne with directives to eradicate any indication of vulnerability from his predecessors. Every attendant, concubine, and worker was precisely documented except one collective. In the Topkapi archives, beneath columns of identities, there existed an empty area, a void where 21 entries should have been. The register indicated, unsuitable for service, eliminated, no dates, no interment documentation, nothing. This constituted how history obliterated them, not with flames, but with withheld ink. And yet the quietude itself transformed into evidence. Only something disgraceful is concealed so meticulously. Ages afterward, an Ottoman courtier's journal emerged in the archives of Bursa, enigmatically referencing foreign women who had declined to yield and vanished beneath the palace foundations. Another correspondence intercepted by Venetian spies in 1484 discussed nuns who wouldn't defer to the Sultan's authority. Collectively, these fragments disclosed a veracity the empire had attempted to conceal. The intentional elimination of women who had transformed into spiritual representations of opposition. The final documentation of Sister Magdalena originates from decades afterward, composed by an Italian pilgrim. He narrated a tale murmured by a palace attendant, a woman who vocalized to her deity until the guard barricaded the chamber. Her identity remained unidentified, but the weak sacred song he described outlasted the stone itself. Within that reverberation, her narrative persisted. As time progressed, narratives of the disappeared sisters transformed into murmured whispers among bondsmen and attendants. On specific full moon evenings, the inferior corridors of the palace would become chilled and the atmosphere carried a subtle fragrance of incense, although no flame burned. Recollection, superstition, or both declined to perish. Ages afterward, European visitors attracted to the exotic enigmas of the Ottoman court heard fragments of the identical folklore. A French diplomat composing in 1712 observed that among the elderly palace attendants endured a prohibited narrative of Christian women who had vocalized themselves into paradise. He disregarded it as mythology, yet the barriers had already revealed the veracity. The sanctuary exists in deterioration presently, however the etchings persist. Faded devotions engraved into the barriers. A murmur of women who declined to be disregarded. Within their quietude, they still communicate. And should you have heard their narrative this evening, permit it to remain with you. Submit a remark. Inform us what you experienced when you witnessed what they endured. And should you desire additional untold narratives concealed in the shadows of history, subscribe and venture further into the obscurity with us.